Hi, everyone. This is Rachel Gerber, Denominational Minister for Faith Formation for Mennonite Church USA, and also the editor of The Gathering Place, which is an interactive website for youth leaders to learn, be, and connect. And every year here, every month on The Gathering Place, we focus on a new theme, and everything we do at The Gathering Place hinges upon that theme. This month, we are talking about what does it take to create durable faith that lasts graduation. We often hear about when our high school youth graduate from high school, they oftentimes also tend to graduate from the church and their faith experience. And so what does it mean to work at ways that we can create a faith that lasts? And so I'm excited today to have Sarah Bixler with us, who is a Ph.D. student at Princeton Seminary in practical theology. And we are thrilled for her to share some of her research and her work that she's done with attachment, and how do we in a healthful way attach our church with our youth, and how does that lead to a durable faith? So welcome, Sarah, to The Gathering Place. Great to have you today. And Sarah just went away. There you are, Sarah. There you go.
I'm in my office at the seminary, and a facilities person just knocked on the door.
Oh, that's funny.
I think we've got an hour now. Sorry about that interruption.
No problem. Well, welcome. It's so great to have you. Why don't you go ahead and just jump on in?
Sure. Well, I spent 8 years as a youth minister in the past, and so the reason that this topic is alive for me is just thinking about my experience as a youth pastor, staying connected to many of the young people who were part of the youth group during my time there at Zion Mennonite Church in Broadway, Virginia, and just thinking about how our strength in the Mennonite Church of community can be both helpful and harmful for young people, and how does it work best for faith formation. So just in my observations and in my own personal experience growing up in the Mennonite tradition, I noticed that sometimes we can emphasize community over and against the individual. And part of my searching and coming to seminary has been asking the question, are there ways that we can better hold these two together so that the formation of the individual as it happens in community is a more healthy thing, which I believe then has a very significant impact on the durable faith of young people after they graduate from high school. So I understand that some people have engaged with the book Sticky Faith, which is, I find, very helpful. I know this book here, there was just a recent discussion group that Shanna led on this. It's interesting, this book, and there's a lot of curriculum and research that goes along with it, comes out of the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. And in this book, Kara Powell and Chap Clark cite that 40 to 50% of high school graduates stick with their faith in college, which means that 50 to 60% don't in their studies. And this got me thinking, what is sort of the Mennonite version of sticky faith? Because sticky faith is written like from a more evangelical perspective at Fuller. And the image of flypaper came to my mind. I don't know if you've ever had problems with flies in your home, but when I do, I will often get a long strip that you can unroll and hang from a ceiling or a door frame or a light or something like that. And it has something on it that attracts flies to it, and they stick to it, and they die there. And so I started thinking, sometimes there are ways that our community can actually be harmful if we cling to our young people and expect them to never move. And so that is sort of the sort of driving concern behind the webinar today. And what that that sort of flypaper metaphor does then in terms of youth ministry is it puts a lot of pressure on youth pastors, I think, and people who work with youth in a believer's church tradition to get people to make a faith commitment through baptism that makes them seem to stick to the faith community. And because we tie baptism so closely to church membership. And I'm afraid that sometimes this causes shallow and premature baptism to occur. And that is not helpful for our young people's faith in the long run. So the webinar today, I've sort of divided into 3 sections of content. First of all, the basics of attachment theory, which I find very helpful for thinking about this question of durable faith. So the basics of attachment theory, and integrated within that, I will draw on some support from neuroscience, brain research. And then the second section will be looking at attachment to groups and what that might have to contribute to our thinking on this question. And then finally, making some more direct applications for youth ministry and thinking about that theologically. And I'll stop for questions and comments at the end of each section. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about patterns of attachment. So attachment theory comes out of the field of psychology, and it was developed in the 1950s. John Bowlby wrote a paper called The Nature of the Child's Tie to His Mother as sort of launching this field of study. And Mary Ainsworth, meanwhile, was studying mothers and infants in Uganda. And she noticed a very strong connection between a child developing secure attachment and the sensitivity of the mother toward the child. And in their studies in the 1950s, they studied mothers and infants, and they did not study fathers or other primary caregivers who currently in 2017, we very commonly are actual primary attachment figures for children. And together, Bowlby and Ainsworth developed the theory of attachment, which basically says that an infant internalizes attachment to a primary caregiver. So the theory suggests that an infant's working model of self develops based on the caregiver's behavior. And when the caregiver offers both comfort and freedom to explore independently, the child will develop an image of herself as worthy and competent. So worthy of love and competent for exploration. However, if the caregiver does not respond sensitively to the child, then the infant will develop an understanding of herself as unworthy and incompetent. And that's a self-understanding that really lasts throughout the lifetime and is very difficult to change. So children may develop either secure or insecure attachment. And Bowlby and Ainsworth set up this really interesting study that they called The Strange Situation, where they brought infants who were 12 to 18 months of age into a room. And first, the mother was present in this playroom. Then the mother left, and they were left in the room with a stranger. And then the mother returned. And what they did was they observed the behavior of both the infant and the mother during this whole 20-minute experiment. And they categorized behaviors into 4 types of secure and insecure attachment. And I'll mention those in just a moment. Secure attachment then was when the infant would go to the mother after this period of separation and receive comfort and quickly go back to playing. In insecure attachment, though, the infant would either avoid the mother completely after she returned to the room, or would go to the mother but would not be comforted and would continue crying. In a book that I would highly recommend by Daniel Siegel, this book here, it's called Brainstorm. The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain. He writes about 3 S's of secure attachment. He says we need to be seen, safe, and soothed in order to feel secure. Seen, safe, and soothed. And he writes that secure attachment offers a safe harbor, so there's the security, but also a launching pad for exploration. And I want you to think about that as we consider this in terms of the church, the seen, safe, and soothed, and then the safe harbor and the launching pad. So Daniel Siegel is, he has his MD, and he writes a lot about neuroscience and how it relates to psychology. And he writes that the brain internalizes as a state of mind this security from being seen, safe, and soothed. And it does this because of mirror neurons that are at work in the brain. And this is what causes children to mimic others. It also allows people to feel empathy. And while I've been talking so far about infants, so in infancy, the patterns of attachment are very critical that are laid down. And these are reinforced through interactions in childhood, but then when it comes to adolescence, this is a particularly crucial period because there are a lot of changes that are happening in the brain. There is neural pruning, where pathways of thought and behavior that are most often engaged are reinforced, and patterns of thought and behavior that maybe used to be there but are not currently engaged are actually pruned away and cut off. So basically, what adolescents, the way they think and what they do is being reinforced in their brains in this pruning process. And then secondly, and relatedly, the neurotransmitter myelin is in high production during adolescence. And that is something that I like to think of it as WD-40 or some sort of grease that makes things slide more easily and work more smoothly. So myelin is actually making neural connections happen faster, more efficiently, and more smoothly. Also, the prefrontal cortex is in high development during adolescence, which means that adolescents are starting to develop the ability to think in abstract terms, whereas in childhood, things were pretty much black and white, and there wasn't a whole lot of nuance going on. And so now there's a new capacity for abstract thought, and this development of the prefrontal cortex also makes possible imagining the way other people might think and feel, which I think has a lot of implications for adolescents' ability to think theologically as well. Thinking about God and thinking about the way God might think and feel. And so this also allows empathy to be more possible, and it also develops capacity for moral behavior, which all increase during adolescence because of these changes in the brain. So back to the study of attachment, infants with secure attachment had mothers, as I said, who responded to their signals promptly and appropriately. They didn't smother them, but they were there for them as needed, and they engaged them in a lot of social interchange. So the caregiver and the infant were mutually delighted with one another. There was emotional attunement that was going both ways. Researchers believe that up to 50% of adults did not grow up with secure attachment relationships in their families, and have had to adapt to insecure attachment patterns. And the insecure attachment patterns come in 3 forms, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you right now because I have these listed. So let me see if this is going to work. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, good. I just realized I have you muted. Okay. All right. Okay. So infants attune themselves to their caregiver's behavior, and their sense of self emerges from this. And so there are 4 different types of primary attachment patterns, and I've described secure attachment. In avoidant attachment, there is a disconnected sense of self where the caregiver is insensitive to the child's needs. In ambivalent attachment, the caregiver responds unpredictably to the child's needs. So sometimes is there for them, sometimes not, cannot really be depended on for consistent responses. And so because the caregiver is not reliable or accurate in understanding the child's emotions or providing comfort and soothing, the child develops a confused sense of self. And then finally, in the tragic case of disorganized attachment, the caregiver represents a source of fear by frightening, disorienting, or abusing the child. And this develops into a fragmented sense of self. All right. Okay. So my theory then, out of all of this, is that just as young people form specific types of attachment as infants with their primary caregivers, so also we can look at young people's relationships to congregations as forms of attachment. And this is actually called attachment to group, which is another something else that attachment theorists study, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So just as the caregiver's behavior impacts the sense of self that emerges from a developing child, so also I think that a congregation's attunement to young people impacts their both relationship to the faith community and also their faith in God. Are young people seen, safe, and soothed in the church? How many of them experience insecure attachment because the congregation is not a place where they are seen, where it is not a place where they are safe, where it is not a place where they are soothed? And can the church provide both a safe harbor and also a launching pad for independent exploration? I think there's a lot of theological resonance for us as Anabaptists as we think about these questions in relation to how young people attach to congregations. At this point, I want to pause for questions and comments before we move on to the next section.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Who has a question? I have just a quick one as we get started. Is what ages do you define adolescence as, like as opposed to childhood? When does that time start?
Yeah, that's a great question. Technically adolescence starts with puberty, which is usually around age 8 or 9. I mean, that's the technical definition of it. So it's basically when a girl gets her period first, or when a boy experiences an ejaculation. So that's sort of the technical definition. There's also this change in the brain with the prefrontal cortex where the capacity for abstract thought begins, and that's usually like Jean Piaget, for example, said can't happen before age 11. I don't know if that's still the case or not some 50 years later. So I would say in sort of that what we call the tween age is when adolescence begins. And it's really a cultural thing as to when it ends. We usually mark the end of adolescence as independence from family of origin, which now is lengthening into the 30s. So for me, I would say about age 11 to 25. But in reality, it's probably a little broader than that.
Do researchers usually see puberty and the development of the prefrontal cortex as related, or are they on two different timetables?
That's a really good question. They are, I mean, they're happening very much at the same time, but I haven't ever read anything about a direct link, whereas like the development of the prefrontal cortex is actually kickstarting puberty or anything like that. I'm not aware of like a direct physiological link between the two, but they overlap, just like descriptively speaking.
Yeah, and I guess pragmatically that'd be, if you work with youth or young people, and you could pretty easily tell, who the early bloomers are and who the late bloomers are, but you probably can't form assumptions about where they might be developmentally as far as their capacity for abstract thought and empathy and those kind of things, just based on physical.
Right, and as you're talking about that, Caleb, and pointing that out, I haven't read that the prefrontal cortex really starts developing before age 10. And there are definitely girls who get their period before age 10. So my guess is that they're kind of separate processes.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, this is a lot of good information to think about. I'm wondering, maybe you said this already, I didn't pick it up, in terms of there's studies about the correlating between the attachment that happens with parents or in the home and the ability then to form attachments with groups.
Mm-hmm.
Just personally here, I'm thinking about my own adopted son who came to us when he was 12. He experienced what I might call ambivalent parenting for the first 12 years, and he has a real difficult time forming healthy attachments to, what I might say, authority figures or groups. Yeah, so I don't know if there's any study on that. I mean, you said 50% of adults experience insecure parenting or attachment. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what correlation that might have with ability to attach, to form secure attachments to a group, to a church, or even to God.
Yeah. You're asking the same question that I am, John, which is why I'm hoping to work on this for my dissertation.
Okay, good. You're going to figure it out.
But, I mean, there definitely are some indications, very strong indications, that attachment patterns that an infant develops will actually sort of shape the way they relate to other people throughout their life. So, and I'll say this a little bit later, but the attachment patterns show up again and again in relation to friends and significant others and marital partners later in life. And so, but having said that, because the brain is always renewing itself, in neuroscience they say because the brain is plastic and it's not fixed, it's always growing and always renewing. There's always a chance to develop different patterns of thought and behavior. So there's actually a name that attachment theorists have come up with for this, and it's called earned secure attachment, which means that an attachment pattern of an infant was insecure. But at some point in their life, because of the presence of attuned and caring others, they have actually formed secure attachment relationships, which hopefully is what is happening for your son even now. And adolescence is a prime time for an attachment pattern to shift because of all the changes that are already happening in the brain. It's harder once you get to adulthood if the attachment patterns are still insecure. But it's never too late. All right, I'm going to keep going, and then we'll have more time for questions later as well. So starting in adolescence, attachment needs, as I just mentioned, are transferred to friends and romantic partners. Daniel Siegel, the author of Brainstorm, who I referenced, he writes, we learn to move away from needing others' care during childhood to pushing away from our parents and other adults and more on our peers during adolescence, to then both giving care and receiving help from others. That's interdependence, end quote. So adolescents will attach to peers, but they still need adults, just in a different role than the way they needed them in childhood. So Siegel actually advocates for adolescents and adults to be an interconnected community, which when he writes that, I've got lights going off saying, that's what the church can do. And the church really is a unique place where there is intergenerational connection in our society today. One of the very few places where that still exists. And it's so important. So research has also looked into attachment to groups. And this is what is most helpful, I think, for us as we think about congregations and youth ministry. So just as the caregiver and infant relationship shapes the child's working model of self, also then attachment to groups is internalized and impacts the sense of self. And this is where the church comes in. So there's a really fascinating study that I found. It was conducted about 15 years ago by Paxton and Moody are the last names of the researchers. And they did a study on emotional attachment in a Southern sorority. And their conclusions are really interesting, especially when you think about them in relation to youth groups and the way youth are attached to congregations. So they define emotional attachment as follows: how close a person feels to others in the group. And again, think about this in terms of youth ministry. And whether he or she is happy to be a member of the group. So this sense of belonging and feeling of morale is what they are measuring to look at emotional attachment in this sorority. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you now again. Just a moment here. Okay. So what I have done here is I have taken this low, high morale and low, high belonging from Paxton and Moody's study, and I've correlated it with the 4 modes of attachment. So ideally, in the church, we would be in the upper right corner, in the area of secure attachment, where adolescents are seen, safe, and soothed, where the church is a safe harbor as well as a launching pad, so that adolescents experience a high sense of belonging and they feel a high sense of morale when they think about their level of happiness to belong to the church. And then on the other hand, low belonging and morale, I would correlate this with the disorganized pattern of attachment, where the church is actually a source of fear for the adolescent. And we know that this occurs, for example, in situations where an adolescent experiences abuse within a congregational setting. And then ambivalent attachment is high belonging but low morale. So this is where the church is not really attuned to the adolescent's needs, yet the adolescent is afraid to leave because he fears separation and is afraid not to explore outside of that probably closed community. And then avoidant attachment, this is kind of an interesting one, is there's a low sense of belonging, but there's still high morale. So this is what I would say is when a church withdraws from an adolescent, maybe during emotional distress, but because the adolescent already feels detached, the adolescent doesn't really care because he's found his security somewhere else. So obviously the ideal scenario, most conducive to faith formation, would be secure attachment with high belonging and high morale. And this, I think, is our Anabaptist community at its very best. So Paxton and Moody's research also investigates subgroups, which is really interesting for thinking about youth groups. So this is where they say that membership in a self-contained subgroup reduces the emotional attachment to the overall group. And a key word here is self-contained. So critiques of traditional youth group models echo this concern, where adolescents are separated from congregational life. They're off in a group by themselves, and this so often, as we have seen, results in young adults being disconnected from church after they graduate from the youth group, because they may come back a time or two to the congregation, but they find that there's no place in the congregation for them anymore. They've graduated from the youth group and they don't have any connections outside of it. So one of my professors, Kenda Creasy-Dean, she writes in her book, Almost Christian, she says, neither young people nor youth ministry can be extracted from the church as a whole. We have known for some time that youth groups seem less effective as catalysts for consequential faith, which is far more likely to take root in the rich relational soil of families, congregations, and mentor relationships. And it's important that Kenda says that, because she's like in the field of youth ministry. She's basically saying the youth group model doesn't work for faith formation in the long term. At least not the self-contained subgroup model of the youth group. So attachment to the congregation as a whole is really critical. And the book that some of you are familiar with, Sticky Faith, also echoes this. I didn't have time to look it up, but I think I remember from that book that they cite that if a young person is closely connected with 5 or more adults in the congregation, that their chances are really high of staying with the church. And that's really key. So I want to show you this really interesting chart or graph that is in the study of this Southern sorority by Paxton and Moody. And I don't need to explain everything that's going on in this chart, but basically what they did was they mapped every individual person in the sorority, and they made a line to who they were connected to. So basically you can see there are sort of like 3 different groups going on within this. And then there's also the isolated subgroup, which they call the small clique. That's that triangle at the bottom. But what they found was that membership in a cohesive subgroup, but not an isolated subgroup, where the individual still has lots of cross-cutting connections outside of that subgroup, will facilitate best attachment to the overall, in their case, sorority as a whole. So it's not a problem to be part of a small group. In fact, that's best. But the small group cannot be isolated. There needs to be lots of individual connections that are going out to many other members throughout the group. So I think it's interesting, and I feel like I wish I could go back to my years as a youth minister and make maps like this of everybody of all of the young people in the congregation and think about where their connections were. Okay. So attachment to the overall group usually happens through a smaller entity, either a subgroup or an individual, often an individual who has a prominent position in the overall group. So because secure attachment develops out of an attuned caregiver relationship, young people need a personal and a tangible representative to help mediate this attachment to the group. This might be a youth advisor, a mentor, a peer who creates a safe space for them and sort of guides their eventual attachment to the group as a whole. And if an adolescent only ever attaches to one or two church members or to an isolated subgroup, then attachment to the church will likely never occur. So I'm also want to be very clear that attachment to the church is not really the end result that we're going for in faith formation. Speaking in terms of attachment to God in Jesus Christ is the ultimate end of faith. And this is what we celebrate in believers' baptism. And there are so many dynamics that affect this attachment to God, and this is what was related to John's question from earlier. So if someone develops insecure attachment in infancy, that pattern is likely going to show up in relationships with other people, relationships with the church, and even relationships with God. However, transformation is always possible. We know that the Holy Spirit works in amazing and unexpected ways. And we also know biologically that changes in the brain happen at any age. So I think that people in the church can help to sort of stand in as mediating entities and facilitate some of this attachment that happens to the church that also contributes to eventual attachment to God. I'd like to open it up for some more questions at this point. Then our last thing will be sort of our applications and a little more theological reflection.
Sarah, I'm curious, you mentioned attachment to 5 or more people in a congregation. And in my congregation, what we have is generations and generations of families, and families that are linked in ways that I'm just only beginning to discover. And so I wonder what that means when relationships to the congregation so closely overlap with familial relationships, what that does to attachment to a congregation. I don't know whether you have an answer to that, but that was just as you were speaking, that's something I've really, really wondered, because we can have 4 generations and siblings all in the same church. And so I don't know whether you toss in family systems theory on top of this or anything like that, but.
That's a great question, Regina. I've certainly been part of a congregation like that before. And I think what really matters is what the group is that the young person sees themselves as attached to. So in that case, what looks like attachment to a congregation might be nothing more than attachment to the family. And so I think it would be really critical in that situation to try to differentiate between the two, between commitment to a family and commitment to faith in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, which is different. And that's actually something that was unclear to me in my own identity process until I was like in my early 20s. And I suddenly realized that being an Anabaptist Mennonite was more than just being part of my family of origin. So yeah, I think helping youth think through distinctions and try to articulate that would be really important in that context. That's a great question. Any others?
I'm wondering, you were talking about connection to church, and I think you're talking like obviously in teen years, the church that they're specifically a part of, but are you also expanding that to later in life being the church in general? Because young people are transient and go to college and then may end up somewhere else in the country, and it's kind of the attachment capacity that they grow into as teens that will then allow them to attach to another church later on.
Yeah, definitely. Clayton, is that your name? Yeah. So attachment patterns change throughout life. And this is part of the concept of the launching pad for independent exploration. So the young person will maybe leave the community at some point. So this is also where the attachment to God comes in, and a strong theology of attachment to God as being sort of manifested within a community of believers, which will hopefully propel the young person to seek similar attachment relationships elsewhere within a congregational setting. Yeah. Do you want to ask a follow-up question? I'm not sure if I fully answered what you were asking.
No, that's what I was getting at. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
What I loved about that constellation image, Sarah, that you put up there, that I've been really thinking about, especially in terms of mentoring, and we explored this, I think it was last year with the Gathering Place too, about new models of mentoring and what works. And what I loved about that is that, which makes such sense with attachment, is that it's not just a one way. It's not just the mentor, feeding into the youth. It's a back and forth. And I think that just, sort of that constellation approach, where the youth can also be givers. And I think that's so important regarding attachment too.
For sure. And that's what Daniel Siegel talks about in his book Brainstorm, when he talks about interdependence. In a healthy attachment relationship. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Well, let me just make a few comments yet about further applications for youth ministry, and also some theological considerations. Because so far I've been talking about psychology and neuroscience for the most part. So attachment to the church is in a really interesting position for us as Anabaptists. So it's not simply a means to attachment to God that can be tossed aside once that is achieved, whatever achievement might mean. I haven't defined it. So there's really a tendency of this in the United States that I've noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, where church communities are largely replaceable, in that there's church shopping and church hopping are two particular terms that come to mind, where individuals and families are searching for a congregation that offers what they're looking for and meets their particular needs, and they will just keep right on searching if it fails to meet their expectations. So what people in that situation are doing is they're seeking a means to another end. And the church is not the end. The church is just a means to another end. And that end might be networking or friendship. It might be entertainment or children and youth activities. It might be engagement in social justice. It might be biblical instruction and an experience of transcendence. It could be all sorts of things, many of them well and good, but the church is just a means to those other things. In the National Study of Youth and Religion that came out, like with the book Soul Searching and some other things, they gave a name to something related to this, which is moralistic therapeutic deism, which you may have heard of, MTD. And Kenda Dean says that parents and congregations are responsible for that kind of individual religious creed where the church is merely an instrument to another end, which is basically personal satisfaction. So there is another end, which I would say in terms of attachment language is attachment to God in Christ, which is something that I think baptism marks. But attachment to church isn't just a means to that end. So it can be both an end and a means. So the church is an end in itself, but it also facilitates, supports, contributes to a deeper faith that is an individual thing, but that community is really important both to foster and then to express that faith. In Anabaptist theology, we speak of 3 baptisms. I don't know if you've come across this before. Baptism of spirit, water, and blood. And this comes to mind. I want to just share with you this quote. Let me share the screen here. From an early Anabaptist theologian, Balthasar Hubmaier. He writes, "I confess 3 types of baptism. That of the Spirit given internally in faith, that of water given externally through the oral confession of faith before the church, and that of blood in martyrdom or on the deathbed." So what Hubmaier is writing about here, I notice 3 different themes going on. So first of all, there's this inward mystery of the Spirit that goes on. Menno Simons calls this regeneration. Other traditions might call this conversion. And then the second thing that goes on is an outward public symbol and a commitment to a covenant community. So what we have here is an individual experience that is then tied to and expressed in a communal experience. And then finally, the fact that this is a lasting commitment. It's a commitment for life, no matter what. It's a commitment to death. This, I think, really raises the stakes for sticky faith or durable faith as we think about it. So for young people in the church, what I'm thinking is that attachment to the church happens sort of in 2 places. It happens in the middle here in the water baptism, but it also happens before the movement of the Spirit might happen within someone. So there's this sense that God uses the faith community at different points in the faith experience of a growing believer. It's not just before their experience of conversion or regeneration, and it's not just after that experience, but God uses the community in several different places, which means that the community can't just be cast aside once someone is baptized. As it's not just a means to another end, it is an end in itself. And it also emphasizes the importance of community without losing an individual component, which is just really critical both for us in the believers' church and for faith in general. So when I think about the question, should the church act like flypaper? I mean, maybe, obviously, no, we should not. Given our Mennonite emphasis on community, it's tempting to go that route, but it's not just about us. It's not just about the church. Anabaptism has a commitment to interpersonal transformation as well. Community is an essential part of that, but it's not the only part of it. So in attachment terms, we want for communities of faith to provide both a safe harbor and a launching pad for independent exploration, and to facilitate the feeling safe, soothed, and to be seen for adolescents, and facilitate these cross-cutting ties as well. So those, I think, are some of the insights for us from attachment theory.
Thank you, Sarah. That was such a wonderfully rich information and lots to ponder. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts, feedback for Sarah?
Sarah, I'm wondering, when you were talking about spirit, water, and blood and the role of the community, how necessary it is to broaden our understanding of salvation in order to make this work. If people in the congregation, if parents are thinking of salvation as an event and not something that's developed, if your goal is to make sure your child accepts Christ, and that's the goal of the congregation, how much more important it is to make sure we have a more holistic understanding of salvation and that we communicate that to folks. Because I feel like as a pastor, I can say it all I want, but there's so many other sources that are telling folks in my congregation that it's an event. And I can't combat that. So what do you do when there's kind of conflicting understandings?
Right. Well, I mean, two things come to mind when I think about this sort of emphasis, an evangelical emphasis on salvation. It's not that we don't care about salvation as Anabaptists. We just think about it in a different way. So it's not so much of an individualistic sort of one-time occurrence as I think it is in the way that you're sensing people's understanding of it. And this is what I really think a theological understanding of regeneration is more helpful. And actually, I mean, so this is a concept that comes from Menno Simons. It's theologically, it's like where our movement has its roots. So it's not, regeneration signals a couple things. First of all, it signals that there is a prior state that to which we're being sort of restored, or that we're being regenerated from. So it signals our created goodness, which is actually very important in the Anabaptist tradition. Something that I noticed at a Reformed seminary where I'm studying at Princeton is that I don't agree with like John Calvin, who believes in, or who writes about the total depravity of the human condition. We were created good, and that's something that Anabaptists are somewhat unique in articulating. And so there is a regenerated state where we are, by God's grace, returned to our created goodness, and we're seen in that light. Also, regeneration is an ongoing process. So when we think about faith, not in terms of a once and done event of salvation or conversion, it's like the ongoing regeneration that is something that happens throughout life. So faith is an unfolding event in our life, and it's something that requires discipleship and faithfulness throughout the lifetime. So for people who are concerned about young people who aren't, getting baptized by age 15 or by the time they graduate from high school, if we can sort of broaden our understanding to think about faith as a more unfolding event, and even in terms of a trajectory, are we moving toward Christ or are we moving away from Christ? Even that can be helpful, I think, in thinking about the lifelong commitment or the lifelong experience of faith.
Great question. Others? Sarah, I'm wondering if you would go back to your youth pastor self again, with all of this knowledge and research that you have now, what one or two things would you do to work at this positive, healthy attachment?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Well, one thing that I mentioned that I would do is to make one of these maps. That would have been really helpful for me, because as a youth minister, I mean, from one year to the next, I usually had about 40 or so young people in grades 6 through 12. who were somehow affiliated with the church, who I was responsible for in some way. So I just sort of went along with this kind of intuitive sense of who was connected and who wasn't. But actually, to make one of those maps would have been really helpful. And then to be able to change my approach of meeting individually with young people, which is something that I did and was very meaningful. But to change my sort of attitude about that from me connecting with them as their youth minister to instead in that conversation asking them what their connections are to the congregation as a whole. That would do two things. Both, it would provide me with information to draw lines on my map. And then secondly, it would also help the young person to think about and articulate who they are connected to. And something that we have learned in youth ministry studies is that when someone can put something into words, it drives the meaning deeper. Mm-hmm. So if they can actually express the kinds of connections that they have within the congregation, that actually makes them stronger, just them telling me about them. And then also, as a pastoral care thing, hopefully to be able to recognize if there are insecure forms of attachment going on in the congregation, particularly of the disorganized type, so that intervention would be possible.
Great, thank you. And I see a final question here from Jane. She said, can you say how cliques/economic classes within the youth group or within church influence attachment?
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. I'm sorry, I forgot to look at the comments. I didn't see it before now. So like the cliques within the youth group, if you think back in terms of that map of the sorority, it would be of particular concern when there are not other cross-cutting ties that go out from that clique. But there are, cliques by nature are exclusive, which is of great concern to us in the Believers' Church as we think about ourselves as a community of disciples, because that really is counteractive to what we're trying to be in the community of faith. So cliques, because of their exclusive nature, will reduce other people's sense of morale and belonging. So if they're functioning in those harmful ways, they're not only not helpful to the people who are in the clique, but they're also not helpful to those who are on the outside of it and are feeling excluded. So basically that there would be a lot of concern there for attachment all around. And then economic classes, I haven't thought about this one in terms of attachment to the church. Sociologically, because of the stress that economic disadvantage places on people, attachment relationships tend not to flourish as easily in lower economic classes. And that's not a fault of someone who, like a caregiver, for example, who raises a child in poverty. It's a function of the level of stress that they're operating under. So that a sense of safety is undermined already because of a lack of access to resources. So it certainly puts someone at a disadvantage for attachment. But that's not to say that young people can't experience secure attachment even when they're economically disadvantaged, because there can still be a lot of emotional security even when there's not as much physical security. But it definitely is has the potential to be a harmful factor there. That's what I would, that's what I've gathered, how I would respond to that question right now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Do you have any final words for us who are considering, this attachment and durable faith in the church?
Yeah, I would. I would want to offer a word of encouragement that it's not up to you. It's not up to you. It's not up to me. It's about us as youth ministry leaders sort of putting a faith community in motion, helping them operate in the way that a community of believers should. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, it takes a lot of pressure off of a youth minister and kind of shifts our role from it all depending on us to being more of a facilitator of relationships within the faith community. So I would offer that word of encouragement.
Thank you. That is a very encouraging word for sure, that it is not all up to us. Yes, but as a community of faith, we can all take part. So, well, thank you, Sarah, for joining the Gathering Place today. And thanks to all of you for taking a little bit out of your schedule and your day today to join us. I will have this posted on our website if you'd like to go back and listen to various parts of it. And I also want to have a shout out that at our Orlando convention, which is happening July 4th to 8th this year, we're going to be having a Gathering Place live event happening at convention on Friday afternoon from 3 to 4 in the exhibit hall at the executive board booth. And so be looking for that conversation time that we will be discussing sort of the future of youth ministry in the Mennonite Church and what do you need, what do you desire, what do you want to see more of. So all are welcome to attend that. So thanks again, and until we meet next time, blessings. Goodbye.